is precisely, and I didn't even check to realize this would be true, what today's gospel was. If there's a missionary parable, it's certainly the parable of the sower and the seed. Because we know in our Lord's explanation of the parable, the seed is the word of God, and it's being spread. What we don't realize, what we often neglect, is the very end of the story as we heard it today. And we know about the seed that fell upon the rock, the seed that the birds ate, the seed that dried up, the seed that was choked by thorns. But what about the seed that actually grew? It doesn't produce the same harvest. Remember, the gospel ended today, and some produced 30, and some 60, and some 90-fold. Now, what's the difference between the 30-fold harvest and the 90-fold harvest? Not the seed, it's the same seed, right? It's the same gospel. And even where it grows, it produces different harvests. How do you account for that? If it were in nature, and it's the same seed, and some of the seed produces more than other, and it's the same seed, then we know it's not the gospel itself. It's not the word of God that's different. It's not the faith that's different. The same Orthodox faith arrives in Palestine, and it produces a certain harvest. It arrives in Greece and produces a certain harvest. It comes to Russia and produces a certain harvest. And it comes to America and produces a certain harvest. There'll be a harvest wherever the seed is planted. But will it be 30 or 60 or 90-fold? It depends on the soil conditions. It depends on the climate, the sunshine and the rain. So what I want to talk about in this first theme, the coming of orthodoxy to Alaska. We know what orthodoxy is. I don't have to tell you that. We're all Orthodox Christians. We know what the holy faith of the ancient church is. When people ask me, tourists come to our churches in Alaska, because if the Congregational Church is famous in Massachusetts since the time of Plymouth Rock, and that type of architecture is what tourists take pictures of and what you buy postcards of when you go to New England, then in Alaska, the churches that people take pictures of, and of which there are postcards, are the Orthodox churches. Because we're there at the beginning of Alaska's written history. So that Orthodox faith came to Alaska a long time ago, more than 2 centuries ago. We'll talk about that the second time, exactly, the historical events and the people that brought orthodoxy to Alaska and what that might have to do with mission in the rest of the United States and the rest of the world. What I want to talk about in this talk is the soil conditions. How was Alaska ready to receive orthodoxy? And how is it possible there for the faith not to fall on rock, not to fall among the weeds, but to grow and to produce a harvest? And what kind of harvest is it? How is it possible? You see, by soil conditions, what we mean is what aspects of the gospel, what in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ resonated with the people who were there in the spiritual condition in which they lived at the time the gospel arrived. And then we can look at America. What are the spiritual conditions here? What's the soil? We're often so busy looking at the seed, studying orthodoxy. We forget to recognize that an equal part is played by the soil conditions into which the seed is planted. We, in our culture, the culture that organizes conferences like this, could draw a timeline, not of the Christian church or of the American Republic, but perhaps of the experiences of human beings on the planet Earth. From the first human beings to the present day. It will be thousands of years long. Probably tens of thousands of years long if we could go back to the first Homo sapiens and even earlier. But we in our culture, the culture that has us all here today, divide this human experience into 2 very unequal parts. We divide it between history and pre-history. It's sort of us and before us. And we study history in school, but we don't study prehistory in school unless we take an anthropology course or an archaeology course. But we're not interested in prehistory. All we know about prehistory is what the Flintstones have taught us. When do you get history? Give me a good German scholarly definition of history. It's written down. You get history when you get written language. If you can't footnote it, you can't use it. Oral history is an oxymoron. We have it now because we have tape recorders. But before the advent of the cassette recorder, the oral history is nonsense. History comes with writing. And when do we get writing? We get writing when we get cities. Writing, cities, history. It's a package deal. Once you get one, you get the other. There are no cities without writing. Writing is an urban thing. And I've often suggested to my history students at the university that we could write world history in terms of the city and the country. Because the city folks are the ones who write history, don't they? When they're on the ups, it's good. That's the point of view. When they're having a bad time, it's the Dark Ages. Who lives outside the city? The kindest thing we can say about the people outside the city are they're country bumpkins. But they're not just bumpkins, they're also hicks. They're also hillbillies. They're also the barbarians against whom you build the walls in order to keep them out. They, by the way, on the other hand, hate the city for some reason that we don't have in writing, since they didn't leave us written records. It's obvious that the people outside the city walls, from time to time, came to town and trashed the place, burned it to the ground. They were violently opposed to this newfangled way of living, life in cities. They didn't think it was healthy for people. We don't have their memoirs. Genghis Khan didn't write about this. Neither did Attila or any of the other so-called barbarians of history. But I suspect this. I suspect this because, although I haven't been there, I've seen enough video footage of the first cities in Mesopotamia. Operation Desert Storm was fought on that terrain, and it's all wastelands of sand, lunar landscapes, where nobody would want to live. Why did the first cities evolve in such a desolate place? Well, the answer is it wasn't desolate when the first cities were built. The first cities emerged among fertile wheat fields that produced more grain than Kansas and Nebraska today. But after 7,000 years, those wheat fields, their fertility exhausted, simply gave out and became those deserts. The deserts of Iraq are man-made. So I have this suspicion about Attila and all their colleagues. They were obviously violently opposed to life in cities, and I suspect not just because they thought it wasn't good for people to live that way, it wasn't good for the earth for people to live that way. That cities make unreasonable and eventually fatal demands on the earth itself and exhaust the earth's resources. They saw city life as something detrimental to people and to the planet, and they were violently opposed to it. In other words, what I'm saying is the people that our histories call barbarians are nothing more, in a sense, than the ancient predecessors of modern-day Greenpeace activists. We dismiss cultures that don't have writing, that don't have libraries, that don't have schools for their kids, as backward, stupid, and ignorant, as uneducated, because we make this equation. Education is what you do in school. And of course, you only get schools when you get history, writing, cities, and this whole package deal. You also get written laws at this point. Way back in the 50s when Cecil B. DeMille produced his famous epic, The Ten Commandments, he has Yul Brynner as the Pharaoh of Egypt. You've all seen the film. Constantly going around saying, so let it be written, so let it be done. Pharaoh can do that. He can order things to be written, and once they're written, you have to obey it. We're also meeting on the feast day of the prophet Moses. He outdid Pharaoh. He had his written laws on stone tablets, not just on papyrus. If it's written, it's powerful. If it's written, it's real. Our society operates on this basis. I doubt if anyone would be here if there were only a rumor going around the western half of the United States that Father Michael might be at such and such a place and time. Something had to be put into writing and printed and mailed out. This proved that this would really happen at this time and place. If it's in writing, we believe it. I have a hard time teaching Alaska history for this reason, because my students believe what's in the books. And the books are literally fiction. The first history of Alaska was written in San Francisco by a man who didn't know any Russian at all. He had a translator hired to translate the few books and documents that he did have at his disposal, but the translator was lazy and didn't like Mr. Bancroft very much. So he got even. He made up entire chapters of the history of Alaska. And 30 years later in court, when he was sued for this, he admitted, yeah, he made up all those chapters. But historians have never gone back, have never bothered to find out what really happened. So when you read James Michener's novel and other supposedly historical documents about Alaska's past, chances are you're reading the product of Ivan Petrov's rather fertile imagination rather than anything that really happened. But I give my students the book, and then I give them my lectures on an audio cassette. And I ask them to read the book and listen to my lectures and then answer the review questions. You know what I always get? The answers from the book. I write F, redo. They come back to me, but Father, it's in the book. I say, yeah, but did you listen to my tapes? Well, not actually, no. Well, listen to the tapes. So the second time around, they listen to the tapes, they say, but they quote me chapter and verse from the book and say, see, this is right, it's in the book. And I say, yeah, but you haven't taken what I said seriously yet. The third time around, they say, well, you say this and the book says this, but I'll still go with the book. Get a clue, I'm grading the paper. In the end, what my students have to realize is what I'm saying, which is based on the oral tradition from the native Alaskans and also from actual research in the Russian archives, contradicts what's in the book. Now, if you don't know whom to believe, the best answer you can give me at this point is, I don't know. Now I have an historian and not just a student in my classroom. I don't know is the beginning of learning. But when was the last time you took a test where the right answer was, I don't know? But that's the answer I'm looking for, and it usually takes an average of 4 Fs, redo, on different papers to get people out of this groove, this ditch we dig for ourselves, that we believe if it's in the book, it's got to be true, and what people say can be disregarded. As Orthodox Christians, we can't live that way. The church is not a major focus of the New Testament. Which came first, I asked a taxi driver who was accosting me on religious issues a few months ago. The church or the New Testament? He said, oh, the New Testament. I said, think about it. When did the church begin? Pentecost, 50 days after the Lord's resurrection. When was the New Testament written? 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years later. The church existed without the New Testament in written form. But the church had the entire New Testament and all the structures of the church herself in oral form. If we as Orthodox Christians, first of all, can't take the spoken language seriously, and that which is passed on to us orally, by personal example, then we are thrown back to the sola scriptura of the Protestant Reformation. What's in the book? I'm not saying the book is false, but the book came out of something. The book was produced by the church. The church was not produced by the book. And trying to produce the church from the book is an impossibility. It's been tried. It's been tried time and again. It's not because the Bible is inadequate, but you see, as I pointed out to a friend just yesterday, if you're reading Navajo myths, or Apache myths, or Yupik Eskimo myths, stories and legends, the stories don't tell you anything about Navajos or Apaches or Eskimos. The story came out of the Eskimo culture, the Apache culture, the Navajo culture. And you have to know something about who these people are, where they lived, live in the present tense, and in what kind of a climate and terrain and so forth to make sense of the stories. But if you try to find out what is a Navajo by reading Navajo stories, you can't do it. The stories aren't about being a Navajo, but the stories come out of Navajo culture. The same is true for the church. You can't figure out what the church is by reading the New Testament because the stories came out of the church, not the other way around. And they're not about the church any more than the coyote stories of the Navajo people are about Navajos. And yet, you can't make sense of the coyote stories unless you know who the Navajo are and where they live and how this applies to their life. So it's a simple anthropological principle here. Now, in other words, here's something very important for Orthodox Christians, and I think it gave us an edge as missionaries, crossing Siberia and into Alaska. Orthodox Christians are very much aware that a lot of their spiritual heritage is not written down either. And not everything is written as the Gospel of John tells us. If everything were written, the world itself could not hold the books. Especially about the church. There's very little about the church in the New Testament. Look it up in a concordance. There's not that many references. We know that Christ starts his church and the gates of hell won't stand against the church. So that eliminates the notion that the real church somehow went out of business early in the 2nd century. Christ promises that won't happen. The Holy Spirit will guide you in all truth, he says. The church is the pillar and ground of truth. That's a quote about the church. But besides that, and a mention about who could be qualified to be a bishop or a presbyter or a deacon, there's not a whole lot about the church and very little about liturgical life itself in the New Testament, from which to construct liturgical life. And yet the liturgical life was there from Pentecost onward. And the church didn't have to write about it. It was doing it. You don't write about what everybody knows and does. You write about what people might forget. So the Gospels get written, and St. Paul writes his pastoral epistles and those that admonish his converts how to behave as Christians. Remember what I told you, he says. He's preached to all these people before. They've learned a lot more by word of mouth than they have in the epistles as well. We forget that those epistles are written to believers, to churches, in fact, not to the general public. They're imprinted in the New York Times. They were written to the churches at Corinth and the churches at Ephesus and the church at Colossae and so forth. And the oral tradition is what sustained the church for the first several generations of her life. So when Orthodox Christians crossed Siberia, they met people who were prehistoric, who had no schools. But they didn't assume that these people were uneducated, because this is a false equation. Education is not what you do in school. I'm a teacher, and I can say that with some conviction. Education is whatever you learn that's useful, meaningful, and or relevant to your life. Our ancestors, yours and mine, were teaching things useful, meaningful, and relevant to their kids orally. You didn't learn to pray from a book. You learned to pray by watching other people do it and learning the words and being guided by someone who believes and really prays. You learn by doing. You don't learn by reading about. There's a wonderful essay C.S. Lewis wrote some years ago called Meditations in a Tool Shed. I commend it to you. In fact, I have a copy with me upstairs in my room if you want it. And it's exactly like this. He says, I went into my tool shed today, and at first I couldn't see anything because it was bright sunshine outside and completely dark inside. And until, of course, his pupils dilated in such a way he couldn't focus on anything. It was just dark. All he could see at first were beams of light coming through the cracks in the walls and the ceiling. And then he stepped into one of those beams of light coming through one of those cracks. And he looked along that beam, out through the ceiling, to the trees and the clouds and the sun 90 plus million miles away. At one point, in other words, he was looking at the beam of light. At another point, he was looking along the beam of light. And you can't do both at the same time. Now, in Orthodoxy, we can look at the beam of light. We can look at our tradition. We can open a Festal Manean and read the hymns. We can study doctrine. We can read the scripture with a kind of scholarly analytical approach. We can look at it. We can look at a church from the outside and draw the blueprints or design the iconostas. We can analyze an icon. That's looking at. But you'll never understand anything about the church by looking at it. You have to look along. You have to get inside and participate. And then your whole universe changes. Your whole universe changes because suddenly you see something 93 million miles away that you couldn't see before. You see the clouds, and you see the sky, and you see the trees, and you see the birds outside. Looking along is a totally different experience from looking at. We live in a world that wants to look only at and refuses to look along. I would define the missionary work of an Orthodox Christian as inviting people to shift from looking at, analytically and usually very critically, to looking along. The difference between looking at that beam of light coming through the crack in the roof and looking along it is a radical one. It changes the way you see the world. And that's what we're inviting people to do as Orthodox Christians. We're inviting people to change the way they see the world. Life, the place of human beings in the world, and the ultimate goal of the whole creation, the whole universe. And as long as they're insisting on looking at it, they won't get it. And you can't look along it in a literary way. You can't get it from a book. No matter how sacred the book is, you can't get it from a book. You have to enter into the total life of the church, liturgically, sacramentally, spiritually, and then you get a glimpse of what the whole thing was about. It's not to say that looking at is no good. That beam of light is still there in the dark shed, and you can see all the dust particles floating around. But you can't see very far looking at the beam of light. You have to get into it and look along it. Now, our missionary ancestors knew that what we did in school was not always educational, as I know from being a college professor. I have taken entire semesters of courses that were not educational in my definition, because I've taken courses that are useless, meaningless, and irrelevant, and paid good money for them besides. So what I'm saying here is schooling and writing ain't all that it's cracked up to be. But we are all cityfied in the sense that we have become literate, and literacy is a factor of being urban and cultured and civilized in quotation marks. And civilized people look down on those bumpkins, those hicks, those barbarians. How could they know anything? They don't read and write. They don't send their kids to school. My grandmother never went to school either. Never had the chance. At 16, her dad invited her to join her 3 maternal aunts in a place called America. She'd never gone to school. She had no idea where America was. They put her on a train. She went through Poland, then got on a boat in Germany, Hamburg. She remembers the name of the town. She couldn't read it off a street sign. I don't know how she knew where she was or how she got there. There might have been a delegation from her village all leaving for America on the same train and boat. In any case, she sailed across the Atlantic, planning to stay for a couple of years, only to help out her family in Ukraine, and was terribly homesick and wanted to go home. And she met my grandfather. At the age of 91, she told me why she married him. She said, "You know, I married your grandfather because he promised to take me home." And then he died, the bum. He died at the age of 32 after they bought a farm and given up hope of going back to the old country 4 kids later. And then the police came to the door to make matters worse for this young Ukrainian widow. "Mrs. Alexa," they said in English, which she didn't understand, "your kids are in violation of Pennsylvania such and such code, such and such number." She shook her head. "I don't understand." So they pointing to the kids and they said, "School. School. Your kids belong in school." School. Huh. Same word. School, school. She got it. "I have no money," she said. She couldn't say that except in Ukrainian, so she would have to open her purse and look, no money, can't pay. No. Somehow that trooper had to get the idea across to Baba. In America, your kids must go to school, but you don't have to pay. This is a revolutionary concept to a Ukrainian peasant. They have to go to school, but it's free. What a country! Yakov Smirnov didn't invent that line. My grandmother did. So my dad and his sisters and brother went off to school. School was an important thing because in the old country you couldn't go. You needed money. You had to pay tuition. Like hiring a music teacher to give your kid piano lessons. If your parents didn't have the interest and the funds to do it, you grew up illiterate. My grandmother never learned to do anything but write her name. But she was an educated woman. She was an educated woman. She was not schooled. There's a difference. She never sat through those useless, meaningful, and irrelevant courses like I did. Of course, there were things in school that she would have liked. She would have been fascinated. I remember in 4th grade being surprised she didn't know that the moon shone with the reflected light of the sun and not its own light. She believed that the moon gave off its light the way the sun gives off it. And she was surprised. And I was surprised that my grandmother in her 70s at that time didn't know what a 10-year-old boy had learned in school. So you develop this snobby attitude. I'm smarter than her. I went to school. I read and write. I know stuff from books. Until you find out the books are all bogus anyway. Like the Alaska history stuff. But people who read get snobby about it. And they tend to look down on the non-literate or illiterate people within their own society as being backward, stupid, ignorant, uninformed. My grandmother was none of those things, although she couldn't read and write. And why would I say that? Because she was the most pious woman I knew. She had her priorities straight. The priest said to me in a parish racked by factions for 100 years, your grandmother was one who never joined any faction. Her only commitment was to Christ and the church, but it wasn't to this group or that group and their agendas. She didn't care anything for any of that. She got up every morning and said her prayers. She went to bed every night and said her prayers. She went to church. She prayed. She went to church to hear someone else read the gospel to her. But she knew the liturgy from end to end by heart and could sing along without the use of books. What use was a book for her? For her, you had to know it by heart because that's the only way you could participate. So you didn't depend on the book like a crutch. How does Gladsome Light go again? By the time she was 6 or 7, she knew that by heart. It was the troparia of the major feasts that you knew by heart. The Kondakia. That's what you know. The way our kids know popular music, this illiterate Ukrainian peasant woman knew all the life of the church by heart. That's not ignorance. That's not backwardness. That's not stupidity. So I grew up knowing that non-literacy is not backward, stupid, and ignorant. And I had plenty of professors in college who thought they knew a thing or two, who I considered all 3 of those. And then I was appointed, as Father Peter mentioned, to attend World Council of Churches conferences and realized how many supposed professors of theology and even of Holy Scripture spoke things that were useless, meaningless, and irrelevant, if not blasphemous, in the name of Christ and His church. I'll go back to my grandmother any day, thank you very much. So now we come to Alaska. The Russian Orthodox traders, trappers, frontiersmen, we would call them in American history. The Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Jeremiah Johnson types. We had them in American history. You know who they are, the coonskin cap guys. Well, there weren't raccoons in Siberia, but they wore the same kind of clothes. They had them in Russia as well. Starting from the 1600s, they had a head start on us. Of course, they had 4 times the country to cover. They were out beyond the frontiers of Russian culture, Russian civilization, such as it was, 1600s, trapping and trading and setting up trading posts and that as bachelors, just like these guys on our frontier. You've seen those movies, the Jeremiah Johnson mountain men kind of guy. They like the adventure of it all, and they're not much for city life. And if they marry some local native girl. And they raise kids who are of mixed parentage. Siberia is populated by people like this. And the same thing happens, we'll talk about it more next time. Same things happen in the 1700s when they make it to Alaska. They come in small boats to trade with buckets and beads and bangles of different sorts. And the Aleut people of the Aleutian chain are very interested in these trade goods, and they said, we want sea otter pelts. The Chinese are paying top ruble for sea otter pelts. We want sea otter pelts in exchange for this. So the guys all go hunting. The Russians go trapping on land, because they're better at trapping on land for the foxes than they are getting into kayaks and hunting at sea for the sea otters. And they move in with all the cute Aleut ladies. It creates some resentment, of course, among the Aleut men who are out of town hunting while this is going on. And little by little, they stay, and they marry, and they baptize. They build the first chapels. How did this happen? I would say way back here in prehistory, there was education going on, and every traditional culture had an educational system that worked something like this. The first thing that a kid would learn in a tribal society is the goal is to teach them who you are. Who are you? Who are we? And all over the world, it's the same answer. In Southeast Alaska, the people call themselves Tlingit. In Southwestern Alaska, they call themselves Unangan. In the center of Alaska, they call themselves Diné. On the western coast of Alaska, they call themselves Yupik or Yupiak, and on the north, Inuit or Inupiaq. These all pretty much translate the same thing. Who are you? Tlingit, the people. Unangan, the human beings. Diné, the people, the human beings. And this ending pik or piak is a bit of one-upsmanship. The Eskimos call themselves, since this ending pik or piak means genuine. We're the real people. There are imposters, of course, out there. We're human beings. What does it mean to be a human being? This is education in a, quote, prehistoric culture, without books, without schools, without writing. A human being looks like this. This number of fingers, they have thumbs, this number of teeth, and so forth, male and female. But there's more to being a human being than what your chromosomes can produce. A human being has to act the way a human being should act. You see, eagles have to be taught how to be eagles. I have friends who have an eagle nest in their front yard, and every summer they have a blessed event. A new eaglet gets hatched. And the eagle, of course, the young eagle grows gradually to adult status until you see it flapping around in the nest with a wingspan 6 feet across. And mom and dad by that time are frantically gathering fish and bringing them to the nest to feed Junior because he has a voracious appetite. So growing and eating are two things that Junior does instinctually, but he doesn't fly instinctually. Not really. If you're born 70 feet off the ground, you wouldn't jump out of the nest either. Not with any confidence. They have to prove to him, look, Junior, this is how it's done, and they flap their wings and they do it, and eventually he learns to fly. But it's a dangerous and scary thing, even for a bird. That's not all it takes to be an eagle. Eagles have to hunt. They have to learn to dive bomb on their prey and grab it with their talons. That's scary too. It's not like being in a jet fighter. You are the jet fighter. And you see, as we do every summer, the parent eagles soar high into the air and then dive bomb onto the North Pacific Ocean, dragging their claws across the surface of the water in a kind of practice hunt. They say to Junior, it's your turn. Junior can fly by now. He can soar up high, but when it's his turn to make this dive bomb onto the water, he goes about 30 feet above it and comes home again. He doesn't go anywhere near the ocean. And you can see the disgusted look on the parents' faces. Junior, that's not how it's done. And you've got to learn this. Honestly, you do. If Junior doesn't learn how to catch fish this way, Junior starves. He's not an eagle, he's a dead bird. So they do it again. And they say, okay, your turn. And he tries again. And he gets within 10 feet of the water, but that's as close as he gets the second time. Mom and dad have to keep doing this, showing him how it's done, and allow him gradually to build up his confidence so that eventually this eagle can behave the way an eagle must behave in order to be an eagle at all. Traditional people have the same view of human beings. You have to show your kids how to be human beings. It doesn't come genetically. They have to be shown the proper way to act as a person. How does a boy become a man? How does a girl become a woman? And each traditional culture had its ideals. How to turn this girl into the kind of woman the society holds as the ideal woman. How to make this boy to be a man the way this society envisions the ideal man. Now, how do you do that? You do it by telling the stories about the way the world really is and the way things should be. The stories about the beginnings of things. In the beginning, as the Gospel of John and the book of Genesis both begin as well. In the beginning, there was the structure of the world. And the structure of the Yupik world, the Eskimo world, is not very different from the Hebrew version. There's the water underneath. It's in a container called the imak. We live on the land, which is sort of floating on the imak. And the whole thing is covered by a kind of superdome, a lid, called the qilak. And in the beginning, there was a connection. In Siberia or Alaska, this connection can be a rope or a tree or a pole or a ladder. It's something like that that holds all these levels together. In the beginning, there was access through this opening in the qilak to the spirit world above, through the nuna into the spirit world below, and free communication with the spiritual realities of this world in the air, in the sky, and on earth. As human beings in the beginning enjoyed this condition, they not only could speak human, they could speak eagle too, and coyote, and wolf, and bear. All the creatures in God's universe have their own language. And we could all communicate. There was complete unity between human beings and all creatures. This, by the way, is perfectly biblical. Only the Gospel of Mark mentions this. But after Christ's temptation in the wilderness, in the very beginning of Gospel of Mark, it's just a few lines, a few words. But after his temptation, St. Mark records, and he was with the wild beasts. For us as Christians, it means this condition of being in harmony with all the animals is restored in Christ. Now, this is very important for a hunting-gathering culture. In the beginning, the animals spoke their languages and had their ways of doing things. The human beings were part of that whole ecosystem, and they have their ways of doing things. So the way human beings behave and the things they're supposed to do are all from the beginning, from the stories that originate here at this end of our timeline. This is the important time when these patterns and models were established forever. This is the structure of the world. It doesn't change from generation to generation. What traditional people are interested in are not the latest theories or hypotheses. They're interested in what we can count on, what's eternal, what lasts, what's fixed. Traditional education wasn't interested in the latest innovations. It's interested in what's true forever. And I would say my family lived in that kind of a world until the 20th century. Because we were rural people, peasant people, not considered barbarians except perhaps by the Germans. But rural people think like these things. It's the spoken word that has power. It's the spoken word that you have to be as good as. When you move to the city and you make an agreement, you better have it signed, sealed, and notarized, and read the fine print. But that's what city slickers do. Rural people aren't sneaky like that, you see. They're as good as their word, and a handshake will do, thank you very much. And it's what you say that counts. And in this century, the world has moved from the country to the city. It's the first time the last 20 years that we can say a majority of the people on the planet have moved from the countryside into town. The cities have won the battle, finally, in our lifetime. Schools have been established for all children. Even the Mongolian nomads have Peace Corps volunteers with them. learning to read and write. And all the great dictatorships of the 20th century have made sure that people learn to read, because you can't follow the rules or absorb the ideology until you can get it from a book. A woman, a Holocaust survivor in Anchorage, wrote a letter to our educational journal a couple years ago and said, I've always been suspicious of schools and books because the people who ran the camps were very well-educated people. And what she was saying in her criticism was, you all talk about back to basics and test scores. Be careful. Before you get to reading, writing, and arithmetic, make sure you have a human being on your hands. Or you may be producing very well-educated future monsters. Because the people who ran the camps were chemical engineers, electrical engineers. It took real brain power to exterminate so many million people so efficiently. The most basic thing she was saying is exactly what we're saying here. You have to make sure you have a human being first. A human being who knows what it means to be a human being, who understands that human beings can't just do anything they want and still be a human being. They can become monsters. Here we have the universe. And this connection was broken. This is the fall of man in the Eskimo mythology. In the Arctic, this rope, this tree, this ladder, whatever it was that held all these elements of the universe together, that gave human beings free access to every place, it's Jacob's ladder. The ladder is broken, and human beings no longer have access, no longer can understand what they used to understand. It's the elders, the first people who knew all for everything, but they also messed up like Adam and Eve. That's the story, you see. So the world isn't the way it's supposed to be. And our remote ancestors had access to God in a way we don't. But that's Genesis as well, isn't it? And here's the thing for Arctic hunting peoples. Because of this break, our relationship with the animals is altered as well. And when you live in a place where there's no agriculture, where you live on fish and meat, because those are the staples of your diet, you're caught in a terrible predicament now. You see, the animals haven't lost their ability to communicate. They still speak eagle and wolf and whale. But we can't understand them anymore. But that doesn't mean they can't understand us. In fact, the belief is they do. And we're on probation. We're the ones who have messed up the universe. They know what we're up to. They understand us. They're watching us. And they see things we can't see. And they hear things we can't hear. And they smell things we can't smell. They know what we don't know. They are not inferior to human beings. They are superior to human beings. That's why Native American art is an art filled with the images of the animals. We think of animals as being of inferior sensitivity and intelligence. Our stories about animals, especially about human beings' relationship to animals, always say that. You know, there's the big bad wolf. To be turned into an animal is a terrible curse in European folklore. The frog prince, will someone please kiss the toad? Then he can marry the princess and live happily ever after. That's just werewolves and stuff. To be turned into an animal is a no good thing. It's a curse. And the predicament of the story is to get this person out of animal form and back into human form so he can marry the princess and live happily ever after. That's the way the story is supposed to end. In Native American stories, in Alaskan stories, to be able to turn oneself into an animal is an extraordinary promotion. And there are stories where the main character remains in animal form and lives happily ever after. I don't have time for those stories. If we had all day, that would be a different story, but I can't give you all those legends.